Hello? Would you like to knit cute little socks for your doll? In this video, I'll show you how to do it and wish you lots of fun knitting along. This is a knitting tutorial video for cheat socks, a quick doll sock with a cheated heel. The name comes from the fact that we're taking a little shortcut with the heel here. We're going to knit what's called a short row heel or boomerang heel using double stitches. But with the cheat sock, only the upper part of the heel is knitted in this way. For doll socks, that's usually enough to create the curve of the heel. To knit these doll socks, you'll need a ball of yarn, about 50 grams. Here I'm using alpaca yarn from Drops. You'll also need a set of double-pointed needles or other knitting needles that allow you to knit small rounds. Then you should also have a pair of scissors, a stitch marker, and a darning needle ready. Ideally, you'll also need 4 stitch markers, 2 of each in different styles or colors. Of course, you'll find the materials list and the link to the detailed Schummelsocks ebook below in the video description. These doll socks are knitted with double-pointed needles from the cuff down to the toe. The cuff is started in ribbing, the heel is worked at first with short rows using double stitches, and the foot is then knitted in stockinette stitch in the round. Finally, the sock is finished off with a band toe. First, the cuff is knitted in ribbing. I start the socks with a long tail cast on and cast on 8 stitches onto each of the 4 needles. This way there are a total of 32 stitches evenly distributed across the 4 needles. By the way, you can easily knit the socks larger or smaller by simply casting on more or fewer stitches. You just need to make sure that the number of stitches is always divisible by 4. Once you've managed the somewhat fiddly start and the first rounds with the double-pointed needles, the sock is quick and easy to knit. There's no need to be afraid of using double-pointed needles or knitting double stitches. With the help of this detailed tutorial, a bit of practice and some courage, even beginners will soon be able to master this technique and quickly knit little cheat socks for their doll. By the way, I'm using a set of Knitpro Cubics double-pointed needles in 2.5 millimeters here. They're about 15 centimeters long. The finished size of the socks for the feet of my 35 centimeter doll is ultimately 5.5 centimeters in length, 4 centimeters in width, and a total circumference of 11.5 centimeters. So there are 8 stitches on each of the 4 needles of the needle set. In the next step, you can now close the round. Now I arrange the set of needles so that I can continue working comfortably. That means the working yarn points to the left and the tail yarn is out of my way. Then the cast-on stitches are now joined to form a round. Make sure that the stitches are not twisted. Work directly in the ribbing pattern as well. This means knitting 2 stitches knitwise and 2 stitches purlwise alternately. Mark the beginning of the round on your knitting with a row counter. That way you can always see exactly where your round begins or ends. I like to do this after the first 2 stitches so that it doesn't slip off the needles. Continue knitting in the ribbing pattern for 12 rounds. The beginning in particular can be a bit fiddly. But it's easy to remember that each needle starts with 2 knit stitches and ends with 2 purl stitches. Here I'm knitting the ribbing pattern, so 2 knit, 2 purl. Of course, you can also knit the ribbing pattern as 1 knit, 1 purl, depending on your preference. Naturally, the cuff can also be knitted in a different pattern, or you can just knit 4 rows in the ribbing pattern, and then simply knit the rest in stockinette stitch, up to the transition to the heel. After 12 rounds in the ribbing pattern, the sock leg is finished. Of course, it's possible to knit more or fewer rounds for the leg to lengthen or shorten the sock according to the doll's leg. In the second step, the short row heel will now be knitted. First, as a transition to the heel, knit 4 rounds in stockinette stitch, that is, knit all 32 stitches in each of the 4 rounds. Especially when knitting the first round of stockinette after a ribbing pattern, it can be a bit tricky, particularly knitting the purl stitches as knit stitches now. But this becomes easier by the second round at the latest, when you can really knit all the rounds in stockinette one after the other. Here too, depending on the desired sock size and length, you can simply shorten or lengthen the transition to the heel by knitting more or fewer rounds in stockinette stitch. After the third heel transition round, everything should be prepared for the fourth round and the following short row heel. For the fourth and final round of the heel transition, you should already have 2 stitch markers ready. The fourth round is also knitted in stockinette stitch across the first 3 needles, up to the 4th needle. The short row heel will then be knitted back and forth in stockinette stitch over the stitches of the 4th and 1st needle. To do this, the stitches are gathered onto one needle and divided into 3 sections using the stitch markers. Once you finally reach the very last needle in the 4th round, carefully knit the first 5 stitches of that 4th needle, and then you can place the first stitch marker right there. Knit the next 6 stitches as well. While doing so, continue knitting all the stitches from the 1st needle as well as the row counter onto the 4th needle. So the 5th needle is set aside, and now we'll continue knitting the short row heel using only the 4 needles of the set. After the 6 stitches that form the center part of the heel, place the 2nd stitch marker and knit the last 5 stitches. In this way, we've now divided the heel into 3 parts, the right and left sides with 5 stitches each, and the center with 6 stitches. Now the short rows for the heel will be knitted using double stitches. The first double stitch is worked on a purl row, which means we first turn the work so that the inside of the sock with the purl stitches is now facing us. For the first double stitch, bring the working yarn to the front, insert the needle into the stitch as if to knit, and simply slip it. While pulling the working yarn tightly to the back together with the stitch, now purl all the remaining stitches on this needle. Before doing so, pull the double stitch tight again to avoid holes. And then simply carry the markers and the row counter along. So now all the stitches as they are on the needle are simply purled to the last stitch. Go ahead and purl the last stitch in the same manner. Then carefully turn your work over once more. At the beginning of this right side row, start by making another double stitch. With the working yarn in front of the needle, insert as if to knit and slip the first stitch. While doing so, pull the working yarn firmly to the back to prevent holes from forming. Then knit all stitches until just before the first double stitch at the end of the needle. As before, remember to move the stitch marker and row counter along. Leave the first double stitch unworked. Leave it on the needle and just knit the last stitch before it. Then turn your work again. At the beginning of the row, make another double stitch. So now there are already 2 double stitches left unworked. They remain on the right needle. Then again, purl all stitches up to the double stitch. At the end, turn your work again. Row counter and stitch marker are moved along again. Here it is important to maintain the correct yarn tension on the purl rows so that the stitch pattern remains even. And especially with the double stitches, make sure to pull the working yarn, which is just laid over the needle, tightly so that the stitch pattern stays neat here as well, or holes. The last stitch before the double stitch is simply purled again, the double stitch remains on the needle, and the work is turned again. There is a double stitch on the right needle. Now insert the needle into the first stitch, slip it as if to knit, and pull the working yarn tight again to the back over the needle. And this is how we work the next double stitch. Now continue knitting all stitches in knit stitch until just before the next double stitch. In this way, double stitches are continuously worked and the work is turned with the rows knitted accordingly in knit or purl back and forth. At the end, 4 out of the 5 stitches are now on the left needle as double stitches. The last one is also purled and then the work is turned. Now, as before, the last double stitch is worked. In the end, between the stitch markers that indicate the center part of the heel, only double stitches remain from the original 5 stitches on each side, right and left. Over the 6th, stitches in the center of the heel simply knit. So, at this point, there are now exactly 6 individual double stitches sitting on the right-hand needle. And you will also find 6 matching double stitches positioned on the other needle as well. With this technique, the double stitches in turning have created short rows to shape the heel. Now we prepare 2 more markers as well as the 5th needle. To prevent a hole from forming right away when continuing to knit at the transition from the heel to the foot, we need to take the first 2 stitches from the 2nd needle onto the 1st needle. Since we will return these stitches to the 2nd needle after a few rounds, we temporarily mark them with another stitch marker. So now we continue knitting in stockinette stitch up to the double stitches. These double stitches are now always knitted together as one knit stitch. So instead of 5 double stitches, there are now 5 knit stitches on the needle. At the end, after the 5th stitch, we now add the additional marker. And then we knit the first 2 stitches of the next needle onto this needle as well. So for now there are 10 stitches on the needle. So on the second needle there are now only 6 stitches left for the time being. All stitches on the second and third needles are knitted. The last 2 stitches on the third needle are first knitted and then, to avoid a hole at the heel transition, transferred to the 4th needle. This is also marked with a marker. As before, the double stitches on this side are also knitted together as one knit stitch. Knit the double stitches together. Double stitches, 5 single knit stitches on the needle. Knit the remaining stitches until the beginning of the round, just before the row counter. Then the 5th needle can be added again. With that, the short rows for the cheat heel are finished. At first, there are 10 stitches for the heel center on the last and first needle. Next, the foot section is knitted by working the next 14 rounds in stockinette stitch. The central stitch markers of the heel can be removed. Only the 2 outer ones remain as a reminder for the 2 borrowed stitches. At the edge, simply slip the marker over the needle and then continue knitting all stitches to the right. For a doll with longer or shorter feet, this part of the sole or instep can also be shortened or lengthened accordingly. So it's helpful to hold the sock up to the doll's foot to knit more or to knit fewer rounds. Now continue knitting in stockinette stitch in the round. Continue until about the 5th round, at which point the side stitch markers can be removed. After about 5 rounds, you can return the 2 stitches picked up at the edges at the beginning, the 2nd or 3rd needle, and remove the stitch markers. So now the 2 borrowed stitches can be knit as belonging to the next needle again. With this trick, you have avoided holes on the side of the heel, and the transition to the sole looks more uniform. Afterwards, there are again 8 stitches on each needle of the set, a total of 32 stitches on 4 needles. Now continue knitting all stitches in stockinette stitch in the round. After a total of 14 rounds or so, once the desired length is reached, the foot section is finished. Finally, the toe section is worked as a banded toe. To do this, knit the stitches on the first needle until only the last 3 stitches remain. Then knit the 2 second to last stitches together and knit the last stitch as usual. At the beginning of the second and later the fourth needle, knit the second and third stitches together with a right-leaning decrease. That means knit the first stitch of the second needle, then slip the second stitch from the left to the right needle without knitting it. Now knit the third stitch, then pass the previously slipped second stitch over the third stitch. Knit all remaining stitches as usual. The end of the first needle and the beginning of the second needle thus form one side of the toe band. Now knit the third needle exactly as you did the first and the fourth needle as you did the second. Knit as described. The first 5 stitches of the third needle are knitted, then knit the next 2 stitches together. Knit the next stitch and simply knit the last one as well. Knit the first stitch of the fourth needle, then slip the next stitch onto your right needle. Knit the third stitch normally, and pass the slipped stitch over the third, just knitted stitch to finish. Continue in the same way, knitting the third needle as you did the first, and the fourth needle as you did the second before. So you keep decreasing the stitches until there are only 2 stitches left on each needle, which means a total of 8 stitches on the 4 needles. These decreases shape the sock so that it tapers to a point at the toe and creates a nice finish. As soon as there are only 2 stitches left on each of the 4 needles, you can also remove the row counter. Since there are only a few stitches left on the needles in the last round, it's advisable to work especially carefully here. And hold the needles a bit more firmly, as they could easily slip out of the stitches otherwise. Once all the decreases have been worked in this way, you're almost done. In the next step, the yarn is cut, secured, and the sock is sewn up. Now use scissors to cut off the remaining yarn. It's best to leave a longer tail, as this can be used for sewing up later. With a darning needle, thread the working yarn through the remaining stitches, lifting them off the needles as you go. Especially if you leave the working yarn a bit longer, you need to be careful not to create any knots or twist the stitches or the yarn. This means you always need to arrange the yarn and the needles properly beforehand. In this way, the stitches are secured one after another and taken off the needle. Finally, pull the wool yarn tightly through the last stitch. Now pull the yarn through to the left side, secure it there with a knot, and then sew it in neatly. After that, the sock is finished knitting. You can now make the second sock in the same way. The doll socks are now finished. Congratulations! You have now learned how to knit cheat socks. Of course, your doll should definitely try on the socks now. In any case, I hope the instructions were helpful, and that knitting along wasn't too difficult, and that you enjoyed it. And that's how easily I knit little socks for my dolls. Have fun knitting along now. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the comments. I'll try to answer everything as best as I can. Also, let me know if you have any suggestions for which tutorial you'd like to see next. Bye, see you very soon.